the early morning hours of a spring day in 1977, Harriet Carr woke up in her Indiana home and realized her husband Melvin wasn't in bed. She got up and noticed the garage door was slightly open. When Harriet pushed open the garage door, she made a horrifying discovery. Her husband was lying dead on the floor. What's even worse is there were 3 more dead bodies in the trunk of Melvin's car. What happened in the garage that morning? Hi everyone, my name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Nini. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Indiana and talk about a con artist, thief, kidnapper, rapist, and suspected serial killer, Melvin Carr. It's almost like Melvin had a goal where he had to commit every single type of crime there is. This was requested by Sheila Flett, 1960, so thank you very much for the suggestion. She mentioned there was not a lot of coverage on this case, and there really isn't. I was able to find a decent amount of information, but not from a lot of sources, and I could hardly find any pictures or videos, and that really bugs me because it's important to me to show the victims' faces and tell a little bit about who they were as a person, and it's just not possible here. If you are a person who watches true crime videos and doesn't just listen to them, I apologize if the visuals are going to be repetitive in here. It's very surprising that this case has not been talked about more because Melvin Carr was a true monster. He committed every crime you could think of, but karma eventually caught up with him in kind of a funny way, and maybe funny is not the word, but in a very unique way when it comes to crime. Melvin Carr was born on January 5th, 1915 in Ohio to James and Bertie. He was the oldest of 4 children. He sometimes went by Ted. Just days after turning 18, Melvin was arrested for his first known crime, but I don't know the details of what that crime was. He worked in construction until he was 27 and then joined the Army. In October 1942, Melvin married 20-year-old Benny French in Virginia. This was noted to be Melvin's second marriage, but I couldn't find any information about his first marriage. This marriage didn't last long because only a year after their wedding, Melvin was single again and back in Ohio. There he met a woman named Harriet who was 3 years older than him. They got married in 1944 and lived in Cincinnati. Melvin found work as a carpenter, and people said he was very skilled with wood. But they also said he was weird and seemed too preoccupied with women. Melvin began telling people in Cincinnati that he was an architect, which was a lie. Melvin was a con artist. A woman paid him $2,400 to build her a house, which is almost $40,000 today. Melvin would keep her updated and be like, oh, the foundation was poured today, or oh, the lumber arrived today. But that was all lies. There was no house. Melvin was just taking her money. Eventually, the woman caught on and he was arrested in November 1946. He was found guilty in May of 1947. The judge let Melvin stay out on bail until his sentencing, which is always a good idea. Melvin had a plan. He filed a motion for a new trial. The judge was required to schedule a hearing to decide if he should get a new trial or not before Melvin was sentenced. So Melvin was just trying to delay his sentencing. The judge didn't get around to scheduling a hearing for a new trial in a timely manner, so Melvin got to live at home and be a free man for a long time. And unfortunately, this allowed him to commit some heinous crimes. In October 1947, Melvin was towing a trailer in Cincinnati and came across hitchhikers. This was husband and wife, Robert and Betty, and I couldn't find any photos of them. They were looking for a ride west. Melvin wasn't heading west, but he decided to pretend he was so he could take the couple on a road trip from hell. Robert and Betty got in Melvin's car and he started driving west. From my understanding, Melvin could have driven the couple to their destination that day, but he told them he owned a hunting lodge even further west and he could get them jobs. It sounded like a good deal to the couple, so they accepted. As you could probably guess, there was no hunting lodge. The 3 found a roadside motel and settled in for the night. The next morning, the 3 got back in Melvin's car and he drove west towards the pretend hunting lodge. As they drove through Kimball, Nebraska, Melvin drove them to a secluded area that was surrounded by trees. His demeanor suddenly changed. He had been very friendly the whole trip, but all of a sudden he was mean and violent. He pulled out a gun and pointed it at the couple. He handcuffed Robert to the trailer, and then he raped Betty. He then beat both of them with his gun. He drove off, leaving Robert and Betty lying on the ground in pain. Someone eventually came along and found the couple and called police. I'm not sure how they were able to link Melvin to the crime, but they were able to do so, and rather quickly, he was arrested and charged with rape and kidnapping. Melvin was let out on bail, and he scurried out of Nebraska and back to Ohio. In the early part of 1948, the sentencing judge finally set a hearing to decide on a new trial for Melvin regarding his home building scheme. Melvin asked for a continuance, and the judge granted it. From my understanding, the judge in Cincinnati knew that Melvin had been arrested in Nebraska for rape and kidnapping, and he still granted the continuance. That is such a common theme in true crime cases. It just seems like court systems are so lenient on criminals, and all that does is allow them to commit even worse crimes. It just happens so much. I don't get it. When the date of the hearing for a potential new trial came around, Melvin was a no-show. With the continuance, he had all this extra time before he had to show up in court, and during that time, he and Harriet moved to Indianapolis. They moved in with Melvin's father, and Melvin started working as a mechanic for his dad's service station. Indianapolis is just 2 hours from Cincinnati, and Melvin was living with his father, so it's not like he was hiding out in the street somewhere. Yet Cincinnati police couldn't find him? I know it was the 1940s, but wouldn't they have known where Melvin's father lived? So wouldn't relatives be one of the first places you'd check for a criminal? It wasn't long before Melvin couldn't control himself and he got in trouble again. In 1949, when Melvin was 34, he was arrested for driving a stolen car across state lines. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Prison doctors psychologically evaluated Melvin. They said he was a self-pitying and sympathy-seeking person with a paranoid social attitude. He had neurotic and psychopathic traits that warped his judgment. They said he was, quote, a hopeless prospect for rehabilitation, unquote. Melvin was only sentenced to 5 years in prison, so he did his time and then he was released. Nebraska had been patiently waiting for Melvin to be released from prison so they could finally try him for kidnapping and rape. But by this time, they couldn't find Robert and Betty. They had never lived in Nebraska, and authorities lost track of them. You would think Robert and Betty would have stayed in contact with police so they could see justice, but by this point 8 or 9 years had passed, and maybe they had started to heal a little from their trauma, and they didn't want to have to relive it. Melvin moved back in with Harriet in Indianapolis. In 1961, Melvin was arrested for assault, but the charges didn't stick. He stayed out of trouble for almost 10 years until 1970. He was arrested after he conned an elderly couple out of their life savings. He convinced an 81-year-old woman to make him power of attorney. He then stole all of the couple's life savings except for $30. The poor elderly woman didn't find out about this until after her husband died, and then she went to the bank and saw that all that was left of their life savings was that $30. That is heartless. Stealing money a person has worked their entire lives to save up. Crimes against the elderly are another level of evil because they're vulnerable. When Melvin was 55, he befriended a family who lived in poverty. He tried to come across as a grandfather figure and told the family he was a church deacon, which of course he was not. Melvin never did anything with good intentions. The reason he buddied up to this family is because he had eyes on their 14-year-old daughter. He told the family he owned a business in Mexico. He offered to take the 14-year-old girl to Mexico and pay for her to go to private schools there. He said he could also get her a job with his business there so she could send money back to her family. Melvin targeted this family for a specific reason. They lived in poverty and they were vulnerable. Melvin knew they would be desperate for money. And he was right. The family agreed to this. In September 1970, Melvin took off with the 14-year-old, driving from Indiana towards Mexico. They stopped at a hotel in Houston where Melvin sexually assaulted her. They continued on to Mexico, and the girl realized pretty quickly there was no private school she was going to go to, and there was no job. She asked Melvin about it, and he told her he would put her in school back in Indiana. They drove back to Indiana in October. Melvin wanted to go back to Mexico with the girl in November, but she didn't want to, and honestly, I don't blame her. Melvin was going to go to Mexico anyway, and he bought her a plane ticket to Houston in case she changed her mind. Melvin took off for Houston, and this girl told a friend what had happened. That friend, thankfully, went to police. When Melvin drove to the Houston airport, hoping the 14-year-old girl would be there, the police were waiting for him. Melvin was arrested for like the 87th time in his life, and of course, he was let out on bail. Back in Indiana, Melvin talked to the girl's parents and said the only way to protect the girl's reputation would be for her to not testify against him. In order to prevent her testimony, Melvin said he should marry her in Mexico. Then there would be spousal privilege. He said after all the legal stuff was done, he would have their marriage annulled. Those parents agreed to this. In December 1970, Melvin, the girl, and her mother headed to Mexico. The mother forged a document that said the girl was 18. In Mexico, Melvin got a quickie divorce from Harriet and married this girl. The girl's mother then finally came to her senses and realized what a horrible thing Melvin had done to her daughter, and she went to the police. Melvin was charged with violating the Mann Act, which was a 1910 law that made it a crime to transport women across state lines for, quote, the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose, unquote. His trial began in March of 1971. Both the 14-year-old girl and her mother testified against him. Melvin was found guilty, and he was sentenced to the max that he could be sentenced, but that was only 5 years in prison. Behind bars, Melvin tried to hire another inmate to kill the 14-year-old girl, 2 federal officers who worked on the case, and the 81-year-old widow he had scammed out of life savings. That failed, and he was moved to maximum security. After serving just 3 years in prison, Melvin was released. And get this, Harriet remarried him. She must have had low self-esteem and didn't think any other man would want her, or maybe she was afraid of being alone. I'm sorry, I know I'm being judgy, but her repeatedly going back to him with knowledge of these horrible crimes that he committed is just pathetic. Melvin and Harriet bought a home in Indianapolis at 940 North Oley Street. Melvin took over his father's mechanic business. Around 4 a.m. on April 20th, 1977, Harriet woke up and realized Melvin was not in bed beside her. She started looking for him around the house and noticed through a window that the door to the garage was slightly open. She figured Melvin must be in the garage, so she walked out to the garage and pushed the door open the rest of the way. To her horror, she found 62-year-old Melvin lying dead on the floor next to their green Buick. The car was still running, so Harriet quickly turned it off. She then noticed the trunk was open. She walked to the back of the car and looked in the trunk. There she saw 3 more dead bodies, people she did not recognize. Harriet started screaming uncontrollably. The neighbors heard her and called police. The 3 bodies in the trunk were 17-year-old Sandra Harris, 24-year-old Karen Mills, and her 2-year-old son Robert Mills Jr. I couldn't find any pictures of them either. Sandra and Karen were friends. Autopsies revealed both women had been sexually assaulted. Police noticed a hose going from the exhaust pipe of the car into the trunk. They found a handkerchief lying near Melvin and a gun in his pocket. The cause of death for all 4 was carbon monoxide poisoning. It's not known for sure what happened that night since everybody involved was dead, but police had a theory. They think Sandra and Karen were hanging out somewhere with Karen's son Robert. Melvin came upon them and forced them into his car at gunpoint. He raped the women and then forced everybody into the trunk. He drove home and parked in the garage. He hooked that hose up to the exhaust pipe. He then turned on the car and left the garage. Police think after some time, Melvin returned to the garage to check if they were dead. That handkerchief that had been found lying by Melvin, they think he held it over his nose and mouth since the garage was filled with fumes. They think he checked the trunk, saw all 3 of them were dead, and then bent over to unhook the hose from the exhaust pipe. They had found that the hose had somewhat melted onto the exhaust pipe, so Melvin would have had a hard time trying to get it off. They wondered if as he struggled to get the hose off, that handkerchief fell and he was exposed to fumes. Being in his 60s, plus he had a heart condition, they think he succumbed pretty quickly to the carbon monoxide. Police looked into Melvin's history and saw that he had been arrested multiple times in multiple states over the years. He had never been arrested for murder, but they did wonder maybe this wasn't his first murder. They looked through unsolved disappearances and murders from the times Melvin lived in Indianapolis, and they found some cases that they do think he is responsible for, and that's why he's considered a suspected serial killer. In January 1967, 35-year-old Lois Williams and her 17-year-old daughter Karen disappeared from their apartment. Lois's car was found abandoned near a service station. The service station that Melvin's dad owned and where Melvin was working in 1967. There was mud on the tires, but no signs of blood. Nothing had been stolen from the car or their apartment. Police had considered Melvin a possible suspect at that time because they found a letter Lois had written to her dad. She wrote that Melvin had raped her and was trying to give her $10,000 to keep quiet. People who lived next to the service station in 1967, a couple known as the Campbells, said they had seen Melvin leave the service station with Lois on the night she disappeared. He returned 2 hours later alone and told them Lois went to a bar. The next morning, Melvin's father ran to the Campbells frantically and said someone had beat up and robbed Melvin. When the Campbells got over there, they found Melvin was soaking wet, covered with sand, and in a daze. They wanted to call police, but Melvin told them not to. When the Campbells walked home past the service station, they noticed everything was still in order. If someone had beat up Melvin and robbed the place, you'd think it'd be somewhat disheveled and items would be knocked over and whatnot. They also noted that Melvin's car had recently been cleaned. It seems Melvin realized the Campbells didn't believe his story and he attempted to kill Mrs. Campbell. Several months after Lois and Karen disappeared, Melvin went to the hospital complaining of dizziness. Once he was in a room, he called Mrs. Campbell and asked her to go to the service station and make sure the door was locked because he didn't want anyone to steal his tools. I have a feeling she told him yes just to placate him because she didn't go to the service station. Her instincts were telling her, "You are weird, and I think you killed a mother and her daughter. I don't trust you." And it's good she trusted her instincts and didn't go because she probably would have been killed if she had gone to the service station that night. Melvin really had checked into the hospital that night, but when his room was checked a few hours later, Melvin and his clothes were not in the room. By the next morning, Melvin was back in his hospital room. He was probably trying to be smart and checked into the hospital so he would have an alibi, and then at one point he snuck out, hid in the service station, but she didn't fall for his crap and his plan didn't work. Good thing Mrs. Campbell was smarter than Melvin Carr. Police never had enough evidence to arrest Melvin for Lois and Karen's disappearances. In 1977, after he was dead, they excavated his yard but didn't find any remains or any buried evidence. However, they did find Lois's suitcase in Melvin's garage. That probably wasn't enough to link Melvin to their disappearance, but even if it was, what were they going to do about it? Melvin was dead. So to this day, Lois and Karen Williams' disappearance is technically unsolved. Melvin's death and crimes were talked about in the paper, and the article included his photo. A 7-year-old girl saw his picture and said that was the man who sexually assaulted her 2 years prior. When she was just 5, a man lured her into his vehicle and assaulted her. She said that man was Melvin. Police wondered if Melvin was the Indiana slasher from 1975. A 14-year-old, 13-year-old, and 11-year-old were hitchhiking and got into a vehicle with a man. He took them to a cornfield, sexually assaulted them, and then stabbed them all with a knife. Luckily, all 3 survived. Melvin did resemble the sketch. Police thought for decades it could be Melvin, but in 2024, genealogy testing linked Thomas Edward Williams to the crime. He died in 1983, so he couldn't be arrested. But it had to feel good to the victims, who were all still alive in 2024, to at least know who attacked them. Harriet died in 1991 and is buried next to Melvin. Gross. You know, it is true that some criminals, even serial killers, can hide who they are from their family. Like BTK was very good at hiding his crimes for decades, and his family and everybody who knew him thought he was just this nice man when he was a literal psychopath. BTK wasn't arrested until he was arrested for all of the killings in 2005. Melvin had been arrested so many times during his life for all kinds of heinous crimes. Why did Harriet stay with him? I do not get that. I feel the legal system was very lenient on Melvin over the years. He got away with so much. He was in and out of prison and he never learned his lesson. It's just ironic that the only person who could stop Melvin Carr's reign of crime was Melvin Carr himself. That's all I have for this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.